I bring up belief because as we've gone through Romans, all the chapters that we have gone through thus far, belief comes up over and over and over. It is stated or implied in almost every passage of this book because Paul is building this case for belief. He's saying, this is your situation. This is the resolution to your situation. Believe this, believe this. And of course, as we've gotten into this middle section of the book where Paul has averted his focus over to his Jewish brothers and sisters, he's insisting that they believe, or he's talking about them why they don't believe. And it's a very specific belief in this book. It is belief in Jesus Christ as Lord, as the Messiah, the one who came, the anointed one. And so it's belief, but a specific belief. Belief in Jesus Christ. And when we talk about belief, there are two different facets to it. And again, we don't think about this, but there are two different ways we believe. We believe up here in our head where we hold intellectual truths, right? We believe this fact about this situation, that's it. But then there's heart belief. It's entirely possible to hold head belief without it descending down to your heart. And I was trying to think of a good example for this, and try this on with me, okay? Let's talk about parachutes for a second, right? You with me? Okay, so parachutes. I believe up here in my being that parachutes work as described. I've seen them work, right? Y'all had the little green army men. Well, you ladies didn't, but we had those little green you throw them in the air, the parachute opens up. Okay, I believe that will work, even though it didn't work sometimes. And so I said, okay, so intellectual belief. But then my brother-in-law, Ed, so Army Ranger, he made his living jumping out of airplanes. I said, well, Ed, you're still alive, so clearly parachutes work. He said it worked every single time. So, okay, so I've got intellectual belief. I have facts that I have verified. All is well, right? But here's the question. Do you have enough belief to hurl yourself out of an airplane thousands of feet above the ground and descend, hopefully slowly, to the ground? That's a different kind of belief, isn't it? You can hold the fact about parachutes, the fact about the physics of trapping that air, you can hold that up in your head and never come to the confident belief in your heart that if I was to jump out with a sheet tied to some strings, that might, let me descend to earth. So we have those kinds of things. We can hold things as fact, but never drop them down to heart belief. When we read in the Bible, when we're talking about belief in the Bible, we are talking about heart belief, about soul belief. It cannot be held intellectually. You can't accept the facts that Jesus was who he said he was, that he came, he died, he rose again in your head, because they won't affect you. They won't change anything in your life. They won't have any impact whatsoever. It's only when that truth, the things we sang about a moment ago, when that descends to your heart, that those things begin to have an effect on your life. So that's the question we ask, and that's the question that Paul is dealing with in this section of Romans. They hold things intellectually, right? The Jewish people recognize that a guy named Jesus died and rose again. That was an indisputable fact. The problem was they held it as intellectual fact because it challenged their biases. They looked at it and they said, well, no, if I believe that, then I have trouble with all my other beliefs here, and I don't want to let go of those things. And so it never made it from here down to here. And this is what Paul is arguing about over and over. So bring that back to the gospel. Set the parachutes aside for a second, even though I know you're thinking about it, right? Set aside and think about the gospel. The belief question is, do we hold the gospel truth here or here? That's the question that we want to address, that Paul is going to address in things here. When we left off in our passage a couple of weeks ago, Paul was leading up to that question, to that challenge again. At the end of verse 10, right? Paul has pleaded with the Jews. I mean, literally pleaded with them to believe. He's called them to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christos, the anointed one. He has called them to believe that Jesus is the culmination of the law, the end point of the law, not a replacement for the law. He is the end of the law. He demonstrates that he kept the law perfectly, something they could never do on their own. So he's calling them, believe that, not up here, but down in here. And if they allowed that truth, that Jesus is the culmination of the law that they treasure so much, if they allowed that truth to set down in here, to become a sole truth in there, he's inviting them to believe and be saved on that basis. And that right there, right at that juncture, getting them to cross that threshold and believe it from here down to here is the trouble that he's running into. And so he's giving this promise to them. He's saying Jesus is the telos, he's the end, he is the culmination of the law. But even more so, here's the thing that he's given them to push them over the edge. Jesus has kept the law for you. You cannot do it on your own. And he would wave his hand and say, look at your entire history. Your entire history, from the very moment that God made his covenant with you, from the very moment that God said, you're my treasured guys, what did you do? You broke the law over and over and over, and you tried. You tried desperately. This is Paul talking to his people. You tried desperately to keep the law. You tried, you failed. You did your requisite sacrifices. You were good right until the smoke rose up, and then you failed again. He says, you've got to stop. You've got to get off this treadmill. Jesus kept the law for you. The one perfect sacrifice has been made. Now believe. Now believe in that. And he used that quote. He used that quote from Isaiah 28, right? So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion. Now this is Jesus now. He's referring to this, right? See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested zone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. Now this is the invitation to believe. There's your cornerstone. There's your foundation. It will never move. It will never let you down. Put your trust in that cornerstone. And the one who relies on it, again from Isaiah, will never be stricken with panic. Paul says, will never be ashamed. So this is the invitation. This is the gospel invitation that he's given. Trust in Jesus. Trust everything I've said. Trust everything you know up here. Now trust it here. Look at the cornerstone and build on that. And so he's given this incredible invitation. And they're still not believing. He's reminded them of everything they already know, everything they've already believed, everything they've already trusted. And their stiff necks will still not allow them to believe. And the trouble that they have, this is what we talked about in our last passage, is that they've tried so hard to keep the law. They have really worked at it. They've invented new laws to help them keep the first laws. And so they've tried and tried and tried and tried. They have devoted entire parts of their history to trying to keep the law. And they know they can't do it because their failure rate is 100%. But they don't want to let go of it. Right? They're holding these truths in both hands. And in order to follow the truth of Jesus, they have to let go of this. Their whole history, of trying to keep the law, and they're afraid to let go. Even though he gives them this quote from Isaiah, it's okay, you can let go. You can trust the cornerstone. But they won't do it. Jesus is everything they ever wanted. Jesus is everything they ever needed. They see in front of them the results of the new covenant, and they just can't let it go. And so what's happening now is because they won't let go, they're holding on to sort of the intellectual side of Jesus. They won't let go of their history of the law over here. And now they're getting angry. Their feelings are getting hurt. And why? Because they're looking around them, and those who are not God's people are believing, being saved, and being blessed by God. They're looking around at the Gentiles, the people who were supposed to be outside of God's blessing. They're looking around them in Rome, and they're seeing all these Gentiles being saved. So they're standing there like this going, it's not fair. And Paul says, you're right, it's not fair. But that's the way things are. So Paul's going to give them a little hope. So if you've got a Bible, we're in Romans chapter 10. He's going to give them a little hope. And we're going to pick up in verse 12 today. Actually, I'm going to read 11 to pull us in. 11 was our last verse last week. So Romans chapter 10, and I'm going to start on verse 11. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. So there's our Isaiah invitation. And then he says this in verse 12. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now really, he couldn't say it any simpler, could he? Call on the name of the Lord, you will be saved. Who will be saved? All who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so, once again, in this little condensed passage here, he's gone and he's pulled everything he said into this place, and he said, now believe, right? He says, for there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. Where does that go back to? Chapter 3, verse 23. All have sinned. All have sinned. All fall short of the glory of God. Boom. Okay? So he's brought that forward. And he says, he goes down a little further. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. Why is that true? Romans chapter 5. Because Christ died while we were still enemies. Christ died and reconciled us back to God. So now we are friends with God. How do I attain to being a friend of God? You believe. You call on the name of the Lord and believe. And so he comes all the way down to that quote from Joel chapter 2. Now Joel, in his context, the prophet is speaking about the day of the Lord. That is when everything changes. Now that's a frightening prospect. When Joel is talking about everything changing on the day of the Lord, he's talking about the end of the end. Here it is. When that comes, you better make a decision. But then he gives this promise in there. But all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Okay, so Paul's built this case, and he reaches once more back into the Old Testament and says, this is what Joel said. We see this someplace else. Peter used this same exact thing at Pentecost. Peter stood up and he said, this is what Joel says. And he talks about young people and what's going to happen with them. And all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. So Paul's not way off here. He's not inventing anything here. So this is what he's inviting them to do. Believe. Call on the name of the Lord and be saved. Call on the name of the Lord. Let go of the law. Jesus kept the law for you. Let go of it and believe. So we pick back up in verse 14. And he's going to give this series of sort of rhetorical questions. One question answers the other as it leads forward. So verse 14, How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? Now, I know some of you got your Greek Bibles out and you've read this thing, so you've noticed the loaded words that are in there that Paul is using, right? So he's building this case. How are you going to believe unless someone preaches to you? How's somebody going to preach unless they've been sent to preach to you? And he builds that case backwards. Would have made a lot more sense if he'd had done it right side up, but he did it backwards here. Now he's saying, how can anyone preach unless they're sent? The word there is apolostin, right? The apostles, those that are sent to bring you the message. One whom is writing this letter to you. I'm giving you these truths. I'm giving you this invitation based on things that you already know. And so he's saying, how are you going to get this if somebody preaches this to you? It's not me just preaching. He's saying the king sent this message to you. This is not just Paul's words. This is not just his casual thoughts. He's saying the king has sent this message to you. Your king, Yahweh, has sent this message to you. He has sent an apostle to deliver this message to you. It's here for you. It's ready for you to hear. So he gives this series of questions expecting no answer from them because he's giving them the answer one after the other after the other. And he's saying, you've heard all this before. You've heard all this. I know you know all this. I know you know the facts. I know you know all the references I'm giving you. I know you know this. Now let it go from here to here. Trust what I'm telling you. See, Paul is banking a lot on who he is. Yes, he's a Christian at this point. But he's the Hebrew of Hebrews. Right? He's Saul. He knows where his people are coming from. And so he's pleading with them on that basis. This is why these chapters have just been paragraph after paragraph of the Old Testament. He said, come on, we've been in this together. We've been in this together. I've led you. You've seen all this. You know all this to be true. He's saying, you know my reputation. You know how I've labored for the gospel. You know this about me to be true. So you know the one that's delivering is telling you the truth. You know all the passages that I gave you in support of what I'm telling you. You know these are facts. You know these are true. And you know my heart. You know I'm in anguish because you, my people, are not saved. So he's given them the three parts of communicating that link with people, that connect with people. He's given them to him right here up to this point. He's believe. Believe. That's all I'm asking you to do is believe. And he ends with that last Isaiah verse. As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Boy, we've heard that before. I want to know more good news. What Paul has laid out in that series of questions is something that you and I can apply. It makes it really easy to share the truth of the gospel. It makes it super simple. Now, we read chapters 9 and 10 and go, whoa, what are you talking about? Simple. This is not simple. This is complicated. This is hard. No. Listen to what he just said in those four questions there. I'll let you in on a little ministry secret, a little evangelism secret here, right? The only people Sometimes you hear this. I'm not qualified to share the good news. I'm not qualified to share the gospel. Okay? Write this down if you need to. The only people who are not qualified to share the gospel are the unsaved. Thank you. Unbelievers are the only ones who are not qualified. Whether you've been a Christian for for 15 minutes, 15 years, or thereabouts, right? If you have been a Christian for any length of time, you're now qualified to share the good news. You say, Pastor, that's scary. It's complicated. It's hard. But it's not. It's not. It's super simple, right? Okay? 15 minutes, 15 years. It doesn't matter. It's really simple. If you're going to share the good news, it's not scary. It's not frightening. Sharing the good news, right? Sharing the good news is a matter of you living your life. Of you carrying on your life as you believe in Christ. Right? If the good news, if the gospel has truly had an effect on your life, and again, think parachutes, if it's moved from here down to here, right? If it's not just intellectual facts, if it's not just truths that you hold intellectually up here, if it has set down in your soul, set down in your heart, you're qualified, you're ready, and you can share the gospel today because it's going to be apparent. It's going to show in everything that you do. It's going to show in every decision you make, every action that you take. Everything you do is going to be affected by the gospel that has set itself in your heart. Now, I know that when I talk about proclaiming the gospel, people get really busy in their laps, right? Their eyes come down because it's scary, Pastor. It's super scary. But it's not. It's not. It's a matter of you being who you are. It's a matter of you living your life. Look at what Paul just taught us here, right? He's given his reputation. He has given facts that the people know are true. And what else has he demonstrated? He has demonstrated his empathy for the people that he's talking to, right? You already know where I'm going with this because there are fancy terms that describe this, and that is ethos, pathos, and logos. You've heard these things before. So ethos is your reputation. Ethos is your standing with the people that you're speaking to. And so that is your personal credibility. So as a Christian, do your words line up with your actions? Does what you say demonstrate is seen in what you do? So if you are credible, right? If you have a credible Christian witness, then you've already locked that in. That means that the person is not hearing you hypocritically. They are hearing you as one who has been affected by the truth that they're going to say or teach. All right? So does your belief show? That's your ethos. That's your credibility, your reputation. Second thing is your pathos. Now, this is your empathy for the people that you are speaking to. Paul's demonstrated this because he's brokenhearted that his people are not being saved. And convincingly so. He has demonstrated that he is absolutely destroyed by the fact that God's treasured people are refusing to believe in the one that God has sent for their benefit. So he's in anguish. Remember that visceral pain that he's feeling because they are not believing. So that's the pathos. He's demonstrating that he cares about the people that he's speaking to. You can do the same thing. If you're speaking about the gospel, if you're just speaking about Jesus, about your beliefs, if you truly care about the person that you're speaking to, like not just standing on the corner and casting this out at the cars that drive by, but like Rick was talking about, he's speaking to a friend that he cares about, that he prays for. Well, that friend knows that. That's why he's asking Rick, these pointed questions, because Rick has demonstrated there's relationship there. Now, if Rick were just walking around the golf course handing out Jesus teas or something, it would be a different thing, because then there's no pathos there. There's no demonstration of care for the person. So your credibility, your empathy, and what's the last thing? Your logos, your truth. This is where people get scared, okay? Well, what if we don't tell the truth? Well, the truth rests in here, doesn't it? Right? I'm not asking you to, tear this passage apart, exegete this, go through and give me all the Greek verbs out of it. That's not what I'm talking about. What do you believe? What is the truth about what you believe? Paul is demonstrating his command of the facts, and he's not doing so from this intellectual, height up here. He's going back, and he's going through the Jewish scriptures. And he's going to remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this. Now believe it. You believed it over there. Now believe it now that it's come true. Right? Now look at that. If you demonstrate that you are credible, that is, what you say is what you do. If you demonstrate that you have empathy for the people that you're speaking to, that is, you care genuinely that they hear what you're saying, and you demonstrate that you have a command of the simplest facts, you have met all the conditions. And you haven't once handed a pamphlet out. You haven't drawn the 4 spiritual laws out on a napkin. You haven't done any of that. What have you done? You have just lived your life as a believer, as a follower of Christ. You have lived your life as though the truth of the gospel has descended from here down into your heart, into your soul. It has shaped and formed who you are. So you are therefore, because you are a Christ follower, you seek to be credible in what you do. You seek to line up what you believe with how you live your life. When you are talking to your neighbor, to maybe one of your kids, when you're speaking to that person, it's easy to demonstrate that you care. I'm not just telling you this just to tell you this. I'm telling you this because I care about you. And because you have such a wonderful teacher standing up here every Sunday, you know the facts that you need to know. You need to know who Jesus is, what Jesus did. And I know that last part makes people, well, what if I get the technical side of things wrong? Listen, people are not going to ask you about the tense of the verb that you just talked about here. They're not going to ask you those kinds of questions. They're not going to ask you about the validity of the resurrection or any of these kinds of things, because they're going to look at you, a credible person, standing in front of them, speaking to them, who cares about them. They're going to ask, who is this Jesus you're talking about? What is this Lord that you're talking about? And so the facts, they're not going to ask you to give them some specific thing at some specific time in some specific way. They're not going to say, give me 10 verses that support this. No, they're going to look at you. They're going to look at your reputation. They're going to look at how much you care about them. And they're going to hear things in a surprisingly good way. Because you're standing there just like Paul is standing before the Jews. You're saying, I care about you. I love you. I want you to hear this. So don't think about, 4 spiritual laws, about how I have to practice my spiel before I can tell anybody about Jesus. No, just be the believer that you are. That speaks louder than almost anything when you speak about Jesus. And so Paul's going to use that idea to kind of wrap up this chapter. So verse 16 is where we were. So he's given them this heartfelt plea, believe. And then he says this in verse 16. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. But I ask, and now he's going to do this rhetorical thing again, but I ask, did they not hear? Did the Jews not hear? Is that the problem? Did somebody not come to them and tell them? And of course, anytime Paul asks a question and answers it right away, you know that the answer is yes. Somebody already did this. Somebody already provided this. Somebody already solved this. But I asked, did they not hear? Of course they did. And he pulls from Psalm 19. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. This goes back to chapter 2. So now nobody has an excuse. No one has an excuse before God because the truth is apparent everywhere. The word has gone out to the ends of the world. And he picks up again. I ask in verse 19, did Israel not understand? You know the answer to this. Yes, they understood. They just refused to believe. First, Moses says, this is from Deuteronomy 32, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. Whoa. Whoa. I think in like wrestling, that's a sweep kick or something like that. He just kicked their legs out from under him there. He said, are you really going to try to tell me that you don't understand what's going on here? And he pulls this verse up. And he says, you're upset. You're heartsick because you're looking around you and all these Gentiles are being saved. Right? Think about Pentecost there. The Jews are standing there with their arms folded going, this is never going to work. Ha, ha, ha. And then shabam! Thousands of people are saved. Paul's saying the same thing here. I get it. I get it. You're upset because those who are not my people are now my people. Those who are not those I love are now those I love. Paul's saying, I get it. I get it. You're upset. And then just to rub a little salt in, he pulls another verse from Isaiah. And Isaiah boldly says, this is verse 20, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. Now, they were just getting up after he knocked their feet out, and he just did it again. He just kicked their feet out from under him. He says, you're upset because the Gentiles who never had an inkling of interest in Yahweh, in Christ, they found him. It's almost like by accident they found him, like they just stumbled across him. Paul's saying, I get it. I get it, you're upset. Now believe. Now believe. God had done everything. Look at this ethos, pathos, and logos. God had done everything he could for Israel, right? He's given Israel every possible chance to have faith in him. He's demonstrated who he was. Certainly his reputation is stellar, I would think, right? Yahweh has this stellar reputation. Everything he said, he did. Everything he promised, he delivered. So they can't doubt that Yahweh is faithful there. Then what? God's pathos, his empathy. Does God care about them? He sent them prophet after prophet to help get them back in line, to pull them back to the right way of living. So they can't argue that. And of course the biggie, what about the facts about God? The logos, the truth. Well, it's indisputable that God is what he said he was. It's now indisputable that Jesus was who he said he was. They can't argue with any of these things. So God has shown perfectly clearly who he is, what he's about. And so Paul ends with this. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long, I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. Now, I want you to see if you and I have the same picture in our mind here. Every time I read this, I get that picture of the Christ the Redeemer statue that stands on the hill above Rio de Janeiro, right? There it is above that city, this arm stretched out. And that's what I picture here. About Israel, God said, all day long, all through our history, I have stood here with my arms open wide, saying, believe me. Put your faith in me. Trust me. And so he's going to go into that in the next chapter. But Paul has demonstrated his credibility, his truthfulness. He's demonstrated his concern. He's demonstrated the things they already know to be true. And he's done all this without the four spiritual laws. He never drew the little chasm and then the cross making the bridge. He never had to do any of that. All he had to be was who he said. And so he leaves this picture of God holding out his hands all day long to a stubborn people. God pleading, believe me. And you know the good thing for us here, 21 centuries later, is that image hasn't changed a bit. We see Christ now instead of this Yahweh figure. But God still stands, arms wide open, ready and willing to welcome anyone who will call on his name, anyone who will believe. And in his perfect divine plan, in the perfect way he has laid everything out, he has left you, his church, his ecclesia. He's left his church in the world to proclaim the good news. And how do we do that? By being who we are. By being Christ followers and showing the power of the transformation of the gospel in our lives. And in doing so, in leaving his church in the world, and leaving you in the world, in empowering you with the Holy Spirit, God's standing there ready and waiting. He's given you the ability and all the power that you need and all the opportunities you could ever want to show his work in your life. And that's all we have to do is show who we are as Christ followers, to show what it looks like to be a person, to be a people who believe, follow Christ, a people who are gripped by the gospel. And in being those people with this God with his arms open wide, that's all it takes to invite other people to do the same. Amen? Let's stand.